The contention I'm making is I don't think the Ukrainian people are ready for self-government. I don't.
What? I want to watch this Charlie Kirk debate because Charlie Kirk is somebody who I generally disagree with on politics, but you know, after Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukraine was kind of like the bipartisan issue where even all the people who said, oh, you know, Russia's never going to invade Ukraine, all the down players, right, who completely discredited the idea and then were proven to be wrong, right, who said it was impossible, they were going to get invaded. Like, it seemed like everybody kind of had a bipartisan support for Ukraine. And in Congress, that's still largely true. You see a few cracks here. There's been some polling data released showing that the majority of Republicans, but it's a very slight majority, like 52%, think that we're like sending possibly too much aid or it should be reduced in some way. And that's the Republican Party, though. As a nation, like, it's still overwhelmingly supported for more aid for Ukraine, right? It's, I know, like, all polls say over 50%. Some polls still say over 60%, right? And there's still also a portion of people who are like, okay, we're sending the right amount of aid. And a very small percentage who are like, we need to send less, so we need to stop aid. It's like 30% or 20%, or something in that range. So the majority of Americans still support aid to Ukraine, but we've started to see conservative commentators start to change their tune as more and more of them come out against aid for Ukraine. And here we're going to be watching Charlie Kirk kind of spar with another conservative commentator who's still on the Ukraine train, who is, and I shit you not, it's Sebastian Gorka. Sebastian Gorka, he's more of an old style conservative, and with old style conservatism also comes kind of like with a more aggressive foreign policy, at least the type of conservatism he comes from. And so we're going to see two people who I don't really agree with on anything, but I'm going to end up agreeing more with Gorka here just because I feel like Gorka is more, you know, supportive of Ukraine. But it's really interesting because I haven't seen Charlie debate this before, and I saw a clip on Twitter which did not paint this interaction very well in his favor, so I wanted to go check that out.
For our conversation we're about to have here, for somebody I really enjoy, and I go on his show quite often, and we were planning out the show, and we said, we want to have some contrarian opinions on the Ukraine situation, because it's such an important topic where we're spending a ton of money, and somebody I have a lot of respect for, and we're definitely going to disagree on some, and I'm going to learn throughout this conversation, is Dr. Sebastian Gorka. Dr. Gorka, welcome to the program. You're host of America First, author of The War for America's Soul, and also check out Substack, Dr. G's briefing at sebastiangorka.substack.com. I think I got that all in there, Dr. Gorka.
You did, and I'm so excited. I think I had this idea last year when we were on a stage together, and we had quite a heated but friendly debate, and I said, let's do this on my show, your show, and finally we're doing it, so I'm super excited, Charlie.
It was mostly peaceful, I have to say.
It was mostly peaceful.
So, Dr. Gorka, I think the best way to start is the floor is yours. Tell us your opinion, your stance on what's happening in Ukraine and how we should think about it.
Right, so I don't want to disappoint you.
Someone just asked me if I like Gorka. No, not really. I don't like Gorka. I don't like Charlie. So this is like watching, no, I shouldn't say that image, but this is just like watching two people I don't like kind of debate. So like no matter what happens, I'm generally okay. Because if Gorka comes out of this looking like a clown, it's like, okay, well, that's funny because Gorka looked like a clown. If Charlie comes out of it looking like a clown, well, it's funny because Charlie came out of it looking like a clown. If they both come out of it looking like clowns, well, that's like best case scenario. But of course, if you put me in a camp here, obviously I would be like closer to what Gorka believes here, because at least he wants to send aid for Ukraine, even though I suspect the reasons he wants to send aid to Ukraine are possibly different than the reasons I want to send aid to Ukraine. And that's happens a lot in communities, in like nations that get support from all around the world, is the reasons people support them could be for totally different reasons. There'll be some people who support Israel because they believe in like the strategic interests of like, oh, I support Israel because they have an effective military in the Middle East and they have a nuclear arsenal, makes them a strong ally in the yada yada yada. And that could be somebody else who's like, well, I support Israel because I'm an evangelical Christian and I believe in the one true, and like, you know, they're completely different reasons, but they end up being in the same camp. And I think obviously, Israel's very different than Ukraine, and this very different conflict involved here. But I suspect it's going to be something like that, like us ending up supporting Ukraine for different reasons.
But I'm not of the Lindsey Graham, let's start World War III variety of people when it comes to Ukraine. But for those who are not familiar with my background,
I don't think Lindsey Graham wants to start World War III. As much as I don't like Lindsey Graham, I haven't heard anything from him that's like, let's start World War III. I feel like that's just, to appeal moderate to Charlie's audience, which might be largely filled with people who are like, stop sending foreign aid. Foreign aid is, so wasteful, even though only like around actually under 1% of our budget actually goes to foreign aid, when the majority of Americans or like a decent portion of Americans, from the numbers I've seen, believe foreign aid is somewhere around like 20 to 25% of the federal budget, which is insane. But that's just because, foreign aid gets harped on so often by commentators online as a scapegoat, because who's going to stand up for the foreigner? Who's going to stand up for the foreign aid? Who's going to stick out their neck to do it? And so it often is just used as a scapegoat instead of, say, I don't know, massive tax cuts for the rich, which caused a massive deficit increase under the Trump administration.
I served as former strategist in the White House to President Trump. I am a legal immigrant to the United States, but my parents lived under a communist dictatorship. My father was actually betrayed by Kim Philby, one of the West's greatest double agents, arrested and tortured at the age of 20 and given a life sentence in a communist political prison. He was liberated by freedom-loving revolutionaries in 1956 and escaped to the West. So that's my perspective.
What country is he from? Is he talking about? I don't know what country he's from, so I don't know what regime he's talking about.
That's what I bring to the table. But irrespective of that, let me be clear.
Hungary? Oh, okay.
Russia has not been provoked into a war. Russia hasn't been surrounded by NATO and has deployed to save ethnic Russians and destroy, bioweapons labs. Russia has been doing what it has always done, whether it was under the Tsars, whether it was the Soviet Union, or under a neophyte Tsar, and that is, of course, Vladimir Putin.
Somebody in chat said, is Eastern Europe a country? Yeah, Sebastian Gorka's accent is very, very hard to pin down.
And this is the aggrandizing territorially of the Russian Federation from a man who, by the way, is a former KGB colonel. And I remember the good old days as a child of the Cold War when all conservatives hated all KGB colonels. The idea that he is some champion for the West standing up against globalists is utterly asinine. This is a man who persecuted Christians. This is a man who is creating his own globalism, but under the fiat of the Kremlin. And let's be clear here. Russia is doing what it always does, violence against civilians to create larger amounts of Russian territory. And for the record, and please, my former MOS in the British Army, I was in the reserves, I was in an intelligence unit.
Oh, he's British. Okay, got you. I'm sorry. It's just like a lot of layers.
You can look it all up now. It's unclassified. Vladimir Putin, since he became president, has been giving speeches. You can read in translation that state not only is Ukraine an illegitimate non-state, so are the Baltic states.
This is true. This is true. Most of this has been somewhat posturing, but this is true.
And so are Poland, which are,
this is true as well,
of course, NATO nations.
So the thing that Gorka doesn't mention here, which I would mention, is that the next big threat, let's say Russia was to win the war in Ukraine. Let's write a scenario where somehow they clean up their mess of the invasion, which isn't completely impossible. I think it's unlikely, but let's say they completely clean up the mess of the invasion and they actually were able to take Kiev. They were able to win. They're able to win the war, right? They're under their original goals of toppling Zelensky's government, the democratically elected government, and installing their own regime in Ukraine. Let's say that succeeded. The next obvious country they would go after would be Moldova. Moldova is a non-NATO state. There's no need, there's no direct, Article 5 kind of response to an invasion of Moldova, because Moldova isn't covered by Article 5. And so there's already Russian soldiers in what is internationally recognized as Moldovan territory in the quote-unquote breakaway republic, quote-unquote, Transnistria, which is super interesting. If you guys want to look up the history of that conflict on your own, or look up some documentaries about Transnistria and how it's a very strange breakaway state. But even during the invasion of Ukraine, there were plans that Lukashenko showed publicly showing that they wanted to use the soldiers in Transnistria in what is recognized as internationally Moldovan territory and invade Ukraine from it, literally launching an invasion from Moldova. Moldova also would be covered by the ideological foundation for this war, maybe not the idea of, oh, this is Russian territory, Russian clay, but it would be covered by the idea that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe and all former Soviet territory in some way has some like ties to Russia. You know, this is their sphere of influence. They can kind of do with it what they want. When you listen to Putin's speech, he lays down a groundwork for the justification of an invasion of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, many other states could be invaded under that same justification. Not that it will happen, but that the justification could easily be used to invade these countries as well. Moldova checks those boxes as well when it comes to the justification, but the difference between Moldova and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland is it doesn't have NATO protection. And that is why I have been constantly ringing the bell about if this was to succeed and they were to continue, Moldova is the next move for the Russians.
This isn't about some fight against Karl Schwab and the WF. This is Vladimir Putin trying to recreate a stunt.
So I just realized that I'm a nerd, so I know what Moldova is. Moldova is this country, like, right... Wait, actually... Oh, gosh. Can we get, like, a map of Europe? Okay, it's right here. What? God... I hate Google. Right here. See where it... See, and, like, if they captured Ukraine, they could not only attack Moldova from the territory that they already control in Transnistria, illegally, mind you, but then they could also attack Moldova from all sides now, from Ukraine, and supported by the Black Sea Navy. Like it would, like Moldova does not have the supplies necessary to stop a Russian invasion. They would put up much less of a fight than the Ukrainians just due to the size, the amount of money they put into the military. And Moldova is also very heavily reliant on Russian energy and has been hit pretty hard by the recent energy crisis in Europe. Oh, and Russia, for those of you who are interested in the internal politics of Moldova, has given literal buckets and bags full of cash to Moldovan politicians in an effort to corrupt them in favor of Russian interests. So they fermented corruption in Moldova in the same way they tried to ferment corruption in Ukraine as well. So you've seen a lot of the same strategies play out in Moldova. Where were we? Oh, yes, here we were.
Version of the Russian Empire, not even the Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire. And as conservatives, we should be on the side that is fighting the Russian KGB colonel. By the way, that doesn't mean Kiev isn't corrupt. That doesn't mean that sending pallets of cash to Kiev is stupid. But we should, if 1776 meant something to conservatives today, guess what? This is Ukraine's 1776.
So I agree with a lot of that, but I want to challenge on that last one that I wanted to do during our last conversation, which is, I think you would agree, Dr. Gorka, that there needs to be, though, a lot of work put in before a country is ready for a 1776 moment, right? For example, Roger Williams, the people need to want self-government, and they need to prioritize virtue and piety. Do you get the sense that the Ukrainian government and people really have done the work that the American founders did leading into that, with studying John Locke and putting that into great thought of George Mason's Declaration of Rights?
Okay, so let's also say that if you look at the years leading up to the February 24th invasion, the Russians invaded because of there was a semi-revolutionary movement on the street known as the Euromaidan, also known, I shit you not, as the Revolution of Dignity, when the people tried to challenge the corruption of the government, tried to challenge the Russian-aligned leadership in Ukraine after they caved to Russian interests. What was happening is in Ukraine, and I say this every time, but I want to make sure that this story gets put out, because a lot of people don't know this, and so I want to say it every opportunity I get. In Ukraine, in 2014, there was a type of legislation, kind of a negotiations that were going on between Ukraine and the European Union that would have started an economic partnership between them. This would have allowed Ukrainians to go through visa-free travel and go to Europe and do work, which would have been very beneficial for a lot of Ukrainians. It was something that Ukrainians really wanted. They would do a bunch of trade deals. It was an economically beneficial plan that the majority of Ukrainians wanted, and that the government of Ukraine promised they would do, right? The elected leader in Ukraine promised that he would do this. Then, once the Russians saw that this was actually closing in and they were going to actually sign this deal, they decided to stop all trade on the border. Literally stop it physically. Physically stop the trade, which is I think it was like 25% of the entire nation's trade stopped, which is a massive economic detriment to your country. Could you imagine if 25% of America's trade just stopped? That would be disastrous for our economy. And there's a word for that, by the way: economic coercion. They were trying to coerce this caving from the government, trying to make them turn around on this deal. They were basically saying, look, you either work with us or we're going to cave out your economy. You either work with us and only us. You don't work with the Europeans. You do not trade with the Europeans in this manner. You do not allow visa-free travel. You're not allowed to get close to the Europeans. You're our, I don't want to say colony, but you're our hoe, in putting it in layman's terms. Act like it. And the government of Ukraine, which was Russian aligned at the time, basically said, okay, Daddy Putin, we'll do whatever you want. And this got a very angry reaction from the people. And they decided to go out on the streets and protest. They went onto the streets and protest. They then, the government then sent the Berkut, which was a special police force, after them. They beat them. They abused them very hard, and they beat them with like metal poles. It was very bad, very abusive. The entirety of the country saw footage of this, of these students getting their heads bashed in. And this made them more angry, on top of the amount of anger they already had, not only due to the fact that Yanukovych went back on his word. That was of course, the leader of Ukraine at the time, but also because he then, in response to people being angry on him going back on his word, brutalized protesters. So then more people went on the street in reaction to the police brutality, which only led to Berkut and to Tutushki, which were hired thugs, basically gangsters that the government hired to go stab and get really brutal with people because they couldn't have the police doing the dirty work. And a lot of them acted in like provocateur roles, where they would go out, smash some windows, and give the justification for the Berkut to go in with their metal poles and beat people. They would tie screws and bolts to flashbangs and throw them into the crowd, so they would go everywhere and like blind people and like hit them in the face and cut them. And people ended up dying from this violence. And not just in Kiev, but in Euromaidan protests that happened all over the country. I actually interviewed a Euromaidan protester, Anastasia, on my main channel. You can go check out that protest footage, if you, not protest footage, but that interview if you want. And she talks about protesters being murdered in Kharkiv as well. And there's a bunch of other elements to this, but eventually this ended with Yanukovych biting off more than he can chew, fleeing the country, and then that's when Russia invaded. There was an interim government. There was then a democratically elected government of Petro Poroshenko. He ruled for a bit. Then there was another democratic election, which no international monitors have found any evidence that this election between Petro Poroshenko and Zelensky was muddled in any way, or that the votes were changed. And Petro Poroshenko peacefully handed over power to Zelensky after he lost, because he didn't deliver on the mandate of Euromaidan when it comes to the anti-corruption elements to it. That was a big thing that people had problems with when it came to Petro Poroshenko, is they felt that he didn't properly deal with corruption and that he was too tied to the oligarchy. And that's why people voted for Zelensky, a comedian, was because they're like, I don't want to say it's a little Trumpian, not in the way that they have the same values, because Zelensky's more of kind of like, maybe, I don't know if I can use the word technocratic considering he's a comedian, but he's more like a centrist-y type. The reason he was elected was because they're like, well, he's a comedian, he's not tied to the establishment. And that's how you got to the world we have today, and the February 24th, when the bigger invasion started. The modern violence that's going on in Ukraine is because of the revolution of dignity. The last 8 to 9 years of violence is because Ukrainians wanted to assert their own economic and political independence from the Russian state, from the modern Putinist czardom. And that is why Russia is invading. That's not the only reason, but it's where all of this modern violence kind of descends from in this specific conflict. So do I think that this is revolutionary in nature, or that the spirit of revolution is there? Yes, I do think to a large degree that is there. And I've talked to a lot of aid workers who put their life on the line and soldiers who put their life on the line, some of which is on camera. I interviewed one aid worker around Kharkiv that you can, again, watch on my main channel. And I asked him, is this a struggle for democracy? And he was very adamant that absolutely, we consider this a democratic struggle, a struggle between democracy, even if it's a flawed democracy. And our democracy, when we started in 1776, was very flawed. We had farmers' revolts, we had violence, we had corruption, we had many issues. We still have corruption today. But that doesn't mean it's not a democracy or that the project cannot be improved upon. America was an experiment, and Ukraine is experimenting. And we shouldn't let the flame that was the Euromaidan revolution be stamped out by the Kremlin. Definitely when the people are very willing to fight for it. The vast majority of polling in Ukraine shows that the vast majority of Ukrainians are willing to take the struggle to the bitter end if it means gaining their freedom.
And forming small governments of the colonies and then eventually having that boiling point over. I only say that because I think that all people eventually can realize the promise of 1776, but I don't think all cultures or countries are ready to immediately teleport.
But also, let me add some nuance. 1776 and the Euromaidan revolution, while economics and trade and stuff like that, obviously they both played a role. The values aren't exactly the same. When I talk to Ukrainians, I talk to them about democracy, I can feel very like American themes in the way they talk to me about democracy and the way they talk to me about representative government and stuff like that. The way they talk to me about institutions and how institutions need to be strong, institutions need to react to corruption, institutions need to persecute corruptions, in a way that they don't trust in individuals. They seem to trust in institutions to some degree. At least the Ukrainians I spoke to. Obviously, not all Ukrainians agree politically, and I'm not going to pretend that's the case. But there is a spirit that is somewhat American, but Ukraine's also Ukraine. It's a different country, and not all countries are the same when it comes to its politics. And so it's not like a carbon copy of America, far from it.
To that moment, and I'm afraid that comparison, especially with Ukraine, is not exactly one-to-one.
No, I agree it isn't one-to-one because we are the greatest nation on God's green earth, and
I'm sorry. I just like, you're right. No one can ever be as amazing as we are. I love it. I love it. Very, very, very chest pounding, huh?
we are the only nation that was founded on the individual liberties bestowed upon us by being made in the image of our Creator. There is, I mean, at that point, the analogy breaks down, but I'm not talking of the qualitative political economy or society or the volunteerism in Ukraine. I'm talking about an independent state. An independent state, by the way.
He should go further. He should go further. It isn't just about independence. It is also about democracy. It is also about representative government. It is also about fighting back against the authoritarianism and the corruption that the Ukrainian state wants to remove itself from, and is still actively trying to kind of cut out of, almost like a cyst, almost like skin that has rotted, need to cut out before they can continue to grow as a country. And Ukraine has made some strides in that, like the removal of the Berkut, the special police forces that were so brutal towards the Ukrainian people during Euromaidan. They completely abolished it. The Russians, though, they preserved it in Crimea. That special police force, they've preserved it in Crimea, where it has engaged in torture and many other brutal acts against people, and also is extremely corrupt. I do think they should do more, though. One of the main things when I talked to Ukrainians in Lviv that they complained to me about, I wasn't only in Lviv, but this was something I heard from Lviv, is I was in a bar that some cops were kind of like, they were technically enforcing the law, but it was really like completely unnecessary. And when I talked to people about it, one of the things they told me is like, corruption with policing in this country is still a major issue that we want to see addressed. It's improved, but it needs to continue to improve.
The way that in 1995, the US president, along with the British Prime Minister, vouched safe the independence of, when we said, look, you may be now the third greatest nuclear power in the world with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but you don't need those nukes, Kiev. Why don't you give those nukes back to the Kremlin, and we will make sure you are safe? That was America's promise to Ukraine, and if Ukraine had those nuclear weapons today, there never would have been an invasion. So, you know, there is also the idea that this is a nation that simply has.
I don't really rag on this point too often because I think I can make the argument for supporting Ukraine outside of the fact that we made a promise. But I do think there is a good argument to be made here about America keeping its word and keeping its commitment when America internationally is kind of not really like, definitely after the Afghanistan withdrawal, especially the idea that we cut tail and kind of left our allies, people falling from planes, that America's word, and after the pullout from northeastern Syria, some people are starting to think America's word's very fickle. They'll just, like, between presidents, they'll just completely turn back on the word. Iran deal, another example of that.
Has lost its independence, irrespective of its political culture or whether they've read the Federalist Papers. No nation, we shouldn't agree to any nation being invaded rapaciously by another one and saying, well, you know what, they don't know the difference between Hamilton and Washington, therefore.
I think you would agree that the contention I'm making is I don't think the Ukrainian people are ready for self-government. I don't.
What?
I think that's we're not in the position to state that. What?
Wait! Did he actually say that? Is that a real position he holds? They've been engaged in self-governance for the last 30 years. They've been fighting for self-governance for hundreds upon hundreds of years. Even if it's not to your exact model and system that you want, which you live in America. You live in the country that has a system of government that is more closely to what you want. They can 100% engage in self-governance. They elected Zelensky, who, no matter what problems I have with him when it comes to his politics, I wish he was more left-wing, right? I wish that he was better on certain labor issues, for example. Even though I have problems with Zelensky, they voted for him, and their elected representative, right, who they elected not to be like an oligarch, not to be a servant of Russia, has been quite effective in leading the country in a resistance of Russia. The fact that Ukraine is standing right now is a testament to their own ability to self-govern and produce a military that is able to resist what is supposedly the second most powerful military in the world. You can't say that about many countries. You can't say that about many countries at all, that they could stand up against the most powerful or second most powerful military in the world, supposedly. And it's not like the invasion of Iraq, like you're doing it from a country halfway across the world. Russia and Ukraine have an interconnected highway system, right? It's literally, you walk across the border, you're in Ukraine. It's right there. Like, they absolutely can engage in self-government. You know what this sounds like? This sounds like a French politician in like the 1950s. Like, the Algerians, self-governance? Bah! What do you mean? They couldn't govern themselves? They're not ready for it. They must be tamed first.
What allows me or you to say you don't deserve to have self-determination?
No, not deserve. That's a different argument. Morally, everyone deserves self-government. You have to. But they
were a nation.
Ukrainians want it. All polling data shows. Even if you go to the most if you go to the Donbass, I've been to the Donbass, I've spoken to the people, and I can give you all the anecdotes I want, but all polling data, there's not all of it that is available seems to indicate that the majority of people in the Donbass want to be part of Ukraine. They might vote differently than people in Lviv, but that's same as the United States, where people in Florida vote differently than people in California. People in California vote differently than people in Tennessee. People in Tennessee vote differently than people in Maine, right? They might vote differently, but the vast majority of Ukrainians, including those in Eastern Ukraine, believe in a united Ukraine, believe in being part of Ukraine, or at least want to stay part of it. So whether or not they want to be their own country is not up for debate. Voltaire wrote about the want of Ukrainians to be an independent country. I don't agree with everything he wrote when he said that, but I do agree that is an indication that this idea of Ukrainian nation state has been around for a long, long time. I mean, this is why during World War I, when the treaty was written with the Russians, they were talking about, okay, let's make the Ukrainian state, because there was an idea of Ukrainian state already in existence, already around, because people knew that Ukrainian identity is real, the Ukrainian language is real, all these things are real. This is not really something even up for debate.
Nation state, Charlie.
Right. So
why? Just because somebody wants their terror. If you have a neighbor who has an IQ of, less than yours and hasn't gone to school and isn't, mature and understands the Federalist Papers, do you get to take their house, Charlie?
Well, no, that's not the argument. It's the argument is whether or not, first of all, the eastern part of Ukraine wants to be part of Russia, right?
That's not true. He doesn't have any evidence to support that. That's just repeating a Russian talking point. That's all that is. He just repeated a Russian talking point. That's all that was. Does he have any data he can pull from? Because I can go get the data that I can pull from. For example, we can look at the secession data, where people in Ukraine all voted in the 1990s to secede and become part of Ukraine from the Soviet Union. They voted for it. In Eastern Ukraine, I think it was 83%. For Donetsk and 82% for Luhansk, right? Or we can do more recent data, which showed that I think it was like 70 to 80% for the more recent data that I've seen want to be part of Ukraine. 70 to 80%, something around those numbers, right? And I don't even know why he's saying this. Like, this is just a Russian talking point.
Anything that has to do with polling in eastern Ukraine is absolutely garbage. The idea that a nation that is under the control of Russian troops is...
All the polling data that I've seen, the polling data doesn't exist right now. There's pre-war polling data that you can review. None of it says that, because he's talking about polling data right now is garbage because you can't examine both sides. That's true. All you can do is poll territory that is not under occupation, which obviously could skew the numbers a bit, but there's pre-war polling data. And the pre-war polling data shows that the vast majority of Eastern Ukrainians want to be part of Ukraine, right? There's pre-war polling data that exists and you can pull from. And of course, there is the referendum that was done on Ukrainian independence, which they also voted for, which was a legitimate vote of secession.
Is going to have fair polling, especially after 1 million people have left that territory. You can't make those assertions. But let's go back to your prior point. Do they not have the right to self-determination as a nation that was independent?
Well, no, of course they do. But the eastern part of Ukraine wants to be part of Russia.
That's not true. Why is he just repeating a Russian talking point? Like a schmuck. He's letting the Kremlin just like make his bullet points for him now? Like, why even just repeat? Why does he have anything to pull from on this?
They speak Russian.
So Russia gets to take it.
These are just all Russian talk. What the fuck? They speak Russian? Really? Okay. Then I was really misled about the Irish. I was unbelievably misled about the Irish. I was told that the Irish wanted to be part of Ireland, but when I go to Dublin, they all speak English. There must be some mistaken identity here. They obviously want to be part of the UK because they speak English. Hey, if they speak it, we spoke English. Does that mean we want to be part of the United Kingdom? I'm starting to see a little. Is his shirt turning red? Do I see a little red coat coming off of Charlie? Is Charlie a lobster back using an old insult for red coat loyalists, huh? This is a bad argument because like there's tons of people all across Africa who speak French because that was the language that was beaten into them by colonists. And that's also what happened in Ukraine through colonization and the banning of the Ukrainian language and discriminating against the Ukrainian language and trying to stop the Ukrainian language from being moved into academia, definitely in areas like Kharkiv, which have large educational institutions. That is how they were able to create the cultural, not only the lower numbers of Ukrainian speaking in Eastern Ukraine and promote Russian across the country, but that was how they beat down the numbers of people speaking Ukrainian and created a cultural standard. And this is how it was explained to me, is that Russian is the civilized language. It is the language of intellectuals and smart people, while Ukrainian is the outback kind of hick language, right? Or if I was to put it in more blunt terms, it's the Walmart people language for Americans, right? That's the kind of culture around the language, or how it was viewed at the time during the Soviet Union, right? During the Soviet Union, which removed the language ban of the Tsardom, that cultural standards still dominated because the Russians dominated the Soviet Union. I can tell you a million anecdotes of stories of like children who were embarrassed for their friends to see their like grandmother who spoke Ukrainian because they thought it made them look like a hick. It made them look like they were like poor and in the backwaters. And so they would there was a story I was told where the grandmother like met their child while like the grandchild while they're interacting with their friends, and so she just pretended that she didn't know her grandmother because she didn't want her friends to think that her family spoke Ukrainian. Like that's the type of like psychology, like I mean like disgusting psychology that went into this. I don't want to rant too much about this because it gets me a little angry, so we're just gonna keep going.
By force.
Well, was there not a peace deal in 2021 publicly put forward where Putin said we can have independent elections be part of that area, part of Russia?
The idea that we take on good faith anything a former KGB colonel says is risible. I mean, this is where, you know, I have problems with people talking about we have to emphasize peace, we have to have an off-ramp, and we have to have negotiations. Really?
Also, again, Charlie, this is wild. I actually didn't know Charlie was this sympathetic to like Russian talking points here. Especially like such uninformed Russian talking points.
Man.
Like, does Charlie think that the referendum in Crimea was legitimate and it wasn't a sham? What about the referendum in Kherson, Zaporozhye, Luhansk, and Donetsk on Russia annexing them, which was blatantly just a rubber stamp, didn't respect the votes of the locals, as they had soldiers go door to door and drag people to polling stations, and they were stuffing the ballots. Not to mention, it's a war. How many people are displaced that didn't get to vote? Ukrainians who fled because they didn't want to be captured by the Russian army. I mean, then again, considering Charlie Kirk gives a lot of sympathy to the idea that that Carrie Lake had her election stolen, the idea that he can't wrap his mind around what is a legitimate or non-legitimate election is not difficult for me to grasp. Anakonovich, 420, thank you for the tier 1 being sub for 7 months.
You have negotiations with somebody who has not kept any promise from the Cold War, whether it was SALT I, SALT II, the Chemical Weapons and Biolabs Convention of 1972. These are not good faith actors. When I worked for the Defense Department, I used to tell the officers I was training, you need to know one thing about Moscow and the Kremlin. Whether it's the Soviet Union, whether it's Putin today, this is an anti-status quo actor. They're not interested in nice peace treaties.
Somebody just brought this up in site chat, and this is true. The only place that the referendum for Ukrainian independence was even close was Crimea. And it still voted for independence with, it was like 54 or 55%. So like, I don't understand why that election is now illegitimate.
Treaties in Geneva or Vienna and stabilizing the situation. Why did they send 300 mercenaries to Syria when I was in the White House? Mercenaries, by the way, that President Trump had killed, and which Putin didn't even mention afterwards because he was afraid of America then.
He's talking about the Battle of Kasham. It is a wild battle where Wagner boys and some Syrian Arab army boys, Assad's guys, kind of crossed the river, crossed an area that was controlled by the SDF, and we annihilated them. I think we killed like 300 or like 400. It was like a crazy number we killed, and we took one casualty, and it was like one injury. And like and as far as I don't even know if the injury came from them. It might have just been a guy like tripping and like falling and like, oh, I banged my head. It was and these were, by the way, kind of a call out here, kind of a callback, right? This is like the prequel in a way. They were the Wagner group. Yes, the Wagner group that's currently fighting in Ukraine. They got annihilated. Now, I don't think that Russia didn't say anything because they were scared of us then. Russia did say some stuff. They just didn't say a lot because I think it was honestly kind of embarrassing. And it was kind of obvious that it was their fault for like just trying to cross into territory controlled by the SDF.
Because he wished to destabilize that part of the world and reap the benefits of that destabilization. The idea that anything Putin does is done in, let's have a referendum. Let's have the people vote. What, as we're bombing maternity clinics in Mariupol? It doesn't sit well.
Dr. Gorka, we have you for, I think, hopefully more than the next segment, but stay right there and check out Dr. Gorka's Substack. And I want to hear from you guys, the audience. Email us freedom@charliekirk.com. But Dr. Gorka, you take balance in nature, don't you?
I do, and you've got to use my link and my.
Oh my God, I don't care. I don't care about the promo. Skip. 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 I could not care less. I could not care less. Dylan, do you want to buy gold? Do you want to buy gold? Gold mined out of the mountains of America? Okay, let's get back to it.
Welcome back, everybody. Dr. Sebastian Gorka. So, Dr. Gorka, let me ask you, what do you think, Dr. Sebastian Gorka, what do you think success looks like at this point in Ukraine?
Victory, like pushing the Russian soldiers out of Ukraine, or giving Ukraine the most amount of leverage we could possibly give them into negotiations that they would inevitably have with either Russia withdrawing from the country or whatever the end of it is. The more leverage they have, the better deal they can get.
Yeah, let's start with, if you're not familiar with it, my favorite international podcast are a bunch of former left-wing stand-up comics who had enough with wokeness and have created something called trigonometry.
It's still Sebastian Gorka. Just a reminder for anybody who was wondering, it's still Sebastian Gorka. That hasn't changed, okay? That hasn't changed. Just because he says one or two things that are correct about Ukraine, that hasn't changed. Trigonometry. Brilliant commentary.
It's one of the best podcasts out there. It's based out of the UK.
Oh, I bet.
And one of the co-hosts is Konstantin Kisin, and he is a Jew whose dad was Ukrainian, his mom was Russian. He has family in Ukraine. He left the Soviet Union as a child, and he was on somebody else's podcast, will remain nameless, who was lecturing him about the need for peace talks and off-ramps and stopping the war. And this guy, who's been to Ukraine recently, who's half Ukraine, married to Ukrainian, who's Russian Jewish, said, you can't have peace talks if both sides want to fight. And that's the kind of razor clarity that we need right now. You can't have any off-ramp or success in the classical Clausewitzian victory terms if both sides want to fight. Now, that's just a statement of fact. Ukrainian...
He's not wrong. I'd phrase this differently, though. Something I think he's not adding here is even if they didn't want to fight right now, but both are still willing to fight. That is true. What the Russians would accept for peace right now is annexation of Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, all of it recognized as being annexed. Neutral Ukraine, meaning they don't enter any defensive agreements that could stop another invasion in the future, and demilitarization. That's what they said is the baseline for them to enter negotiations. Getting 25% of that would be ridiculous. So if that's their baseline for negotiations, when the Ukrainians are just like, leave, that's our baseline for negotiations. Get out of our country. Goodbye. Bye. They asked for reparations, stuff like that, which I guess could be negotiated down and stuff in. But like these are two like positions that have no way to like intertwine right now. They don't. And so until they basically punch each other out until they have no choice but to negotiate, or even if it's a ceasefire, not a permanent peace deal, or that one side wins, like I don't see the war ending anytime soon. And I think talking about the war ending right now or tomorrow is kind of a pipe dream. It's not really possible under the current circumstances. People could tell me I'm wrong, but all you have to do is wait and find out. Unless there was something drastic that would change the dynamics of this war.
Will fight not to the last man, Charlie. They'll fight to the last 12-year-old who can hold an AK. Why? Because they remember what Russia did to them in the 20s and 30s, the Holodomor, 7 million Ukrainians stuff.
Okay, he's exaggerating a little bit with a 12-year-old with an AK. But it is true that Ukrainians are pretty dedicated to fight this out to the bitter end. And from every conversation I've had with a Ukrainian, I don't think I've found one who is willing to compromise on any of the peace terms that the Russians offered. So they're pretty devoted to this. And I don't want to like do but I am better than Ukrainians when it comes to knowing what they really need. I don't want to pull that card. I don't think anybody should pull that card. Definitely when we're talking about an independent struggle, right? One that has decent viability, by the way, considering that they won the battle for Kherson. They took back the only provincial capital the Russians captured the entire war. They had the counteroffensive in Kharkiv that was extremely successful. I don't want to be the one to tell them, hey, you've won a lot of battles, but you got to stop because, Putin said, possibly extremely vaguely and very milquetoastly that they reserve the right to make the world explode. So if you keep fighting, the world will explode. Like you sound like a doomsday prophet here. That's what you sound like.
starved to death by Stalin. So they'll fight to the bitter end. On the other side, you've got Vladimir Putin, who's got his reputation on the line, said that the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century was the loss of the Soviet Union. So for various reasons, he's going to fight. So right now, the best we can hope for, it's not victory, but the best we can hope for is the conflict de-escalates into what is called a frozen war. Like
why would Sebastian, see, this is the problem with Sebastian Gorka. Why is it that everyone seems to be scared of winning when it comes to this war? It's just like, oh, it's impossible that the Ukrainians just win. I mean, I gotta say, reclaiming Crimea is going to be a difficult task, and I don't know how likely it is. Probably even more on the unlikely side. But we underestimated the Ukrainians before, and I will not be the person to underestimate them again.
Transnistria, like South Ossetia, like Moldova, where the sides stop actively shelling each other every single day, but where there is no territorial gains made. Sadly, for the time
is a possibility, though. I'm very scared that as there's less movement on the front line, and that's why the spring of this year is going to be so important, there's a possibility that these lines kind of just entrench to a point where it's going to be very difficult to get somebody out of the trenches, which is already an issue when you look at the Donbass, where a lot of the area that the Russians captured and the Ukrainians have had for the last 8 years of fighting have been a lot more difficult to fight over because of how entrenched those positions are. It's why the Russians, in large part, are having so much difficulty with the Donbass, is because these positions have been built up over 8 years. That's why taking Kramatorsk sounds like a death wish for the Russian army.
Time being, that's the best we can hope for.
Do you think us supplying weapons get us closer to that or get us more towards kinetic conflict?
So when it comes to supplying weapons, this is hugely important. Right at the beginning of the war, I wrote an analytic piece, I think it was for Breitbart. And what I said back then, 10 months ago, hasn't changed today. The idea that we should be sending, that anybody, the Germans, the Brits, or the Americans, should be sending Western weaponry to Ukraine and cash is insane. This is a former republic of the Soviet Union. What they need is Soviet-era equipment, which is standing in stockpiles in former Warsaw Pact nations like Hungary, like Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania.
So what Gorka fails to mention here is, number one, Hungary is not going to give their weapons to Ukraine. Hungary is led by Viktor Orban, who has blamed the Ukrainians for this war on multiple occasions and is not sympathetic to their struggle whatsoever. He's a far-right maniac, and he does not care about the Ukrainian struggle whatsoever. He cares a lot more about his ties with the Russians. So that's the first thing, right? Second thing is a lot of those stockpiles have been sent over. There's stuff left. But the idea, and I don't know why Gorka has this position, that position might have made sense at the start of the war, but now as these reserves dry up more and more and more, and the countries that have the largest reserves still standing are a lot of them are not countries that are going to ever send these reserves of tanks, like Hungary. Eventually, whether Gorka likes it or not, whether Charlie likes it or not, whether any of these countries like it or not, eventually Ukraine is going to have to move over to Western and NATO standard weapon systems if we're going to continue to work with them and send them equipment. Not only because it's going to be, we could train them on them and we have the trainers for it, but because we can continue to produce that. We're not producing Soviet standard artillery shells. Like Ukraine could just run out of those. And you can even see that from the amount of shelling the Russians can do in comparison to the amount of shelling the Ukrainian do. Where a lot of times on the front line, it's like 1 Ukrainian shell for every 10 Russian shells, because they just don't have the amount of shells or the amount of artillery guns to match it. And whether we like it or not, we simply cannot make up that deficit with Soviet stockpiles alone, and there's not a lot of countries, if really any, that are producing these old Soviet-style munitions. We can maybe get a few factories up and running, maybe a few across former Warsaw Pact countries, but it's still not going to make up the deficit. They are going to need Western weapons if we're going to give them a fair shot at taking the W here. Oh, also, yes, we're going to be watching the State of the Union address, but let's finish this first, and that's at 9, so we got 40 minutes.
They need to divest. Like, this is the Polish deal. Remember the Polish deal? Poland said, we've got MiG-29s. We'll give them to Ukraine if America backfills them. Biden says yes, and then 48 hours later, because he's a feckless, senile old git, changes his mind.
We do not know that he said yes for sure. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. I don't think the Americans ever publicly agreed to do it. Does anybody remember? I don't remember either. But I do agree that we should have done it. We should have done it. I do agree with that. If we're not going to give them the F-16s, which Biden has committed not to doing, the least we can do is try to get them more MiGs, because they're already trained on that anyway, like Gorka's bringing up. But again, eventually, there's going to have to be a transfer. There's going to. Not to mention, definitely if Sebastian Gorka has any dream of Ukraine ever joining Western alliance structures, even if it's not NATO, being a NATO standard, it's going to help them if there's a possible future conflict, which, I mean, that's terrifying to think of, but this is not the first time that Russia's invaded Ukraine.
So they should be supplied equipment they know how to use, not Abrams tanks that nobody in Ukraine has ever driven, that have 19 different types of oil to run them. And
I trust the Ukrainians who have been asking for these types of tanks. Now, I will say Abrams is probably the best case he can use against this, because the Abrams tanks has a very heavy logistical load. But when we're talking about the Leopard 1s, right, which are being sent over now, 100 new Leopard 1s have just been agreed today and announced from the German foreign minister who was visiting Ukraine, are going to be sent from the Netherlands, Denmark, and a few other countries. Those tanks have less of a logistical load, and there's over 2,000 of them. Now, I'm thinking of the Leopard 2. There's thousands of Leopard type tanks in Europe and across the world that could be possibly sent over, right? And again, I just want to say, we're really trying to scrape the bottom for these old Soviet reserves. We went to Morocco and convinced them to send over tanks to Ukraine. We're really, I don't want to call Morocco scraping the bottom of the barrel, but we're really going to where's what's that woman, Carmen Sandiego? We're Carmen Sandiegoing this. We're going to all the locations all around the world to try to get aid to Ukraine from old Soviet stockpiles. We have to eventually transfer them over to Western systems. It's just inevitable. The Czech president, for example, who was just elected, as somebody just brought up in Twitch chat, this is a point he hits on constantly, and I agree with him on it.
That need a resupply chain from America. No, give them Soviet-era equipment that we don't want anyway. Give them ammunition. And lastly, just because we have a dominance in
We have a lot of equipment in reserves that are so old that the odds of us ever using them are next to nil, that we could also still be sending over when it comes to things like troop carriers, which are going to be necessary to not only get troops to the front line and act, maybe not as the armored spear, but part of the armored advances. And it also is vital in evacuating wounded and injured civilians and soldiers.
In ISR, in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, when it comes to military satellites, give them the target packets to hit the Russians that are on their territory where it hurts. That's the best that we should do, and let them fight their 1776. No U.S. troops, no U.S. material, because
I agree with no U.S. troops outside of maybe the most basic of kind of CIA, hey, we know they're over there, there's a spot, but again, I don't understand the high opposition to any Western systems. We've seen how effective the Javelin and the NLAW's British, not American, how effective they were in the early weeks of the war, and how effective NATO training and the M777 howitzers has been. I mean, what about the HIMARS, which has been absolutely, I don't want to hype up a weapon too much, but glorious when destroying Russian logistical lines and blowing up their reserves behind the back and the back lines way behind the front lines in Russian occupied Ukraine. These are Western weapons, not Soviet weapons, that have been decisive in helping the Ukrainians. All analysts agree with that. So I don't know why he says that it can only be Soviet. This is a weird, strong commitment to have.
because it makes no strategic sense.
It absolutely does. Gorka's completely off base here. I think he just hasn't adjusted his position over the last 10 or 11 months.
So, but we are sending tanks and we are sending weapons and funding. And so your position is more nuanced, that it should be, we should try to do this.
His position is, I guess you could say, more nuanced, but it's like nuanced to a degree that's completely unnecessary.
Prudently, but I suppose, Dr. Gorka, one of the reasons I'm so entrenched in my position that we should have no involvement, no aid, is I don't trust any of the military elite right now.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Could you imagine, like, look, it's really sad. The largest mass grave since the Yugoslav genocide uncovered in Europe was uncovered in Izium, over 440 bodies. Like, Bucha's really sad. You know, the largest art heist since World War II in Nazi Germany. You know, over 15,000 pieces of like oil paintings and old, like over 2,000-year-old Scythian gold, literally stealing the culture of a nation, directly organized by the military. It's not just soldiers taking like random cups, ancient cups, put them in bag, but it's organized by the military. You've got all these atrocities happening, all this death happening. And you're like, well, you know, I would support that nation, but oof, the elites, am I right? What a silly, silly reason.
Yeah,
the military's too woke for me.
That is very reasonable. That when you have a overweight chairman of the Joint Chiefs who has admitted calling up his counterpart in Communist China, General Lee, when we were in the Trump administration, and saying, "Don't worry about my boss, the president. If he does anything with China, I'll give you a heads up." I mean, that's treason. That man should be in the brigand shackles, not in the highest military position in the United States. We've heard in the last 48 hours that of the balloon flights across America.
This is China. This is whatever. It was a different administration. Oh, whatever.
When we were in the White House, we weren't told either by Secretary.
I gotta say, it is bad. It is bad that general is going behind the president's back. That's bad because he's the commander in chief, and I believe institutions over individuals, right? But it's also, I think it's a bad sign that the military had so little trust in Trump that they were willing to do that. But by the way, he's saying they should go in the brig for that. That's something that was often practiced in the Trump administration. John Bolton talks about it in his book. Multiple people have talked about it in their books afterwards, that there would be people who would constantly, in Trump's administration, keep information away from him, where he would give orders and no one would just follow up on him because they were just completely ridiculous. Trump would a lot of times just forget about them. So, I mean, this was like an entire administration problem.
Mattis or by Mark Milley, again, derelictions of duty. So the lack of trust of our military above, let's be clear here, I've worked with the U.S. military for decades, above the rank of 05 is warranted. Anybody above 06, 05 is a problem, but that doesn't mean that Russia invading other countries isn't a geopolitical problem that we are going to have to deal with.
That's what I want to pick up on after the break. You know all about radio breaks.
God, man, Gorka, like first part was okay, did okay-ish. This part, complete nosedive. Let's see if he can pick it up at the end. I mean, this is such a strange position on the Soviet weapon stockpiles. Let's move forward. Let's get past his vitamin supplements and his gold shilling and like the Alex Jones InfoWars style promotion and whatever. Let's get past all of this. I do not care. Okay. War
for America's Soul. Also, check out his wonderful radio program. So, Dr. Gorka, we are up against a radio break, something you are all too familiar with. Make the case as to why this tangled and complicated dispute war is a pressing and urgent national security concern for our country.
First, before I do that, we don't get to do this often enough. You know, I'll have Dennis on my show when he writes an amazing op-ed. I'll have Dinesh if he does.
Hey, my favorite Dennis Prager op-ed, which is who he's referring to, is how he did like a 3-part series of essays about why when a wife says to you in bed, "No, I don't want to have intercourse with you," the wife should have intercourse anyway, and she should fulfill her quote-unquote wifely duties, and that denying a man sex is wrong. And like, it's like a really weird essay. He's basically debate broing about like, you should sleep with me. Here's my 3-part essay. It's really funny, a series of essays. Go check it out. It is really weird.
Does a new movie, but we need to do this more often. And whilst I am on your show, because it's easier for me to do it, everybody out there, I don't care who you are, where you live, you need to support Turning Point USA.
Did he say Dinesh D'Souza? I thought he said Dennis Prager. I could have sworn he said Dennis Prager.
It is perhaps the most important organization in America that is taking back our high schools and our colleges. So God bless you, Charlie. And what you've done in the last 8 years is remarkable. Let me start with a question to you. If this were 1940, would you have supported the Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union?
No.
Wow. Really? 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 Wow. That's a bold strategy. Let's see if it plays out for him.
Really?
Which land? I'm sorry. I think I answered
the
the
land
question.
lease to the Soviet Union and the Brits. So during World War II, that we sent about $750 billion worth of weapons to the Soviet Union, which was not exactly a republic of representative democratic principles. Did it make sense to stand up to a bully back in 1940?
So you're talking about empowering the Soviet Unions against Hitler?
Yes.
So the Soviets against Hitler? Is
yes.
that?
No, I'm talking about.
Yes, that is what FDR and the administration did, and it was a smart move. We sent, I think at one point, like 20% of the trucks that the Soviet Union was using was American. Which I mean, obviously we didn't make all of their stuff or whatever, but we substantially sent stuff over there to help them. I mean. But like, no matter what you think of the Soviet Union, and by the way, Ukraine and the Soviet Union, if you made that comparison to Ukrainian, they'd slap the ever hell out of you. But like, you can't compare these things. But the logic is solid. Like, Hitler's bigger threat, should not be invading Soviet Union, should not be invading Poland, right? Partially Soviet Union's fault for deciding to split Poland up with them and basically secure Hitler's flank for him to invade France, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium. But the logic is solid that if Hitler wins against the Soviet Union, there's no stopping him.
I'm not as familiar with the details of this. I'll be very honest. I'm not as
let me make you very simple.
familiar with this. So
let me make it very simple.
It was food, trains, and trucks. The trains and trucks was to help logistically, because Russia has always had logistical problems with their military. This war is just another example of that. It's a massive country. It has to be connected through trains and trucks. If you don't have trains in Russia, like, and you don't have interconnectedness, like how are you going to govern the state, let alone fight a war?
Do what we do today.
It's actually, I'm sorry I keep interrupting. It's part of the reason why right now the rail crisis and airline crisis that Russia's going through due to sanctions is really crippling the country in a way, and could really cripple the war effort in a way that would be disastrous for the Russian government if they are not able to domestically produce replacements for, railway and train parts and airline parts. With, I believe, the Yale study that talked about the state of the Russian economy, and this was like 5 months ago, this was a while ago, talked about how the Russian economy saw about 40% of their airliners, their airline planes grounded because they were basically scrapping them for parts or taking parts out of it and putting it in another plane, which is also not advisable from what these companies tell them. Tell them, like, don't do that. That's not advisable. Do not do that with planes. That's very dangerous.
In the terms I discussed, I'm not talking about M1 Abrams and pallets of cash, but providing the means for the Ukrainians to fight for themselves. Why that is?
Again, like, it doesn't necessarily need to be Abrams, but also the Ukrainian economy obviously has been really ransacked right now, and they do need some help economically as well, and I don't have a problem with sending over some money to help them in the meantime. I have no problem with that. Also, is that a Judge Dredd badge on the right side of that? Looks like a Judge Dredd badge.
Is actually
right side of his thing next to the American emblem. It looks like a Judge Dredd badge.
A national security interest of the United States is very simply because of what you remember from your childhood at school.
Sorry, I keep interrupting him, but somebody in chat just said he sounds like Vosh. If Vosh was conservative, I do think he'd probably just be Sebastian Gorka.
Simply because of what you remember from your childhood at school. If a bully is permitted to get away with bullying, they will proceed to keep on bullying. You can remember a bully from the playground at school. The only time a bully stopped bullying is when somebody stood up to them and gave them a bloody nose. That's when a bully stops. When you have somebody who is a remnant, a relic, a dinosaur of the Cold War, who says the loss of the Soviet Union is the greatest tragedy that we have faced, invades another country, and then states repeatedly that the other countries bordering that nation are illegitimate, have no right to exist, that is a state of affairs that America will not be able to stay out.
By the way, when people talk about Russian national security interests, right? Russia, in a way, kind of says if there's a country bordering Russia, we have a right to their foreign policy. Like, we have a right to basically in some way control their foreign policy. That for them is like, we need to secure every side of Russia. There's already an inherent problem with that, right? This idea that if you touch my borders in any way, like, you must be subservient to Russian national security interests. But Russia is the largest country on earth, so it's also the worst possible country to have this mindset.
Out of, even if you believe in neo-Buchananite, Tucker-esque isolationism. When if they landlock the bottom, if Mariupol is landlocked across Russian-controlled territory, and there is no way to actually send the goods from Ukraine to North Africa, then there will be an absolute disaster in terms of starvation on the African continent. That will again be something America can't stay clear of. It's like saying it doesn't matter to us. These nations can collapse, and there will be no consequences. There will be consequences.
It's true in a I mean, like, I don't agree with all the arguments we made here, but it is true that in a globalized world today, the idea of like, oh, an economic catastrophe, a famine, that has nothing to do with us, is really silly. Even from a selfish perspective, when you think about, like, for example, a lot of people say, why should we do anything in South America? Why should we care whether if the cartels control this or the violence or the anything? And then we'll be the same people to be like, why are there so many migrants? Why are there so many refugees? Oh, really? Oh, wow. Now you care? Now you care. Like, the world's interconnected, and people need to grow up to that.
No, just to make sure I understand, because I don't think I totally know the issue as well as I probably should. Can you just educate me on the lend lease you mentioned, of who we lended weapons to and what was the context there?
So when we
during he's going to say the same thing, but during World War II, in the lead up to World War II, we sent a lot of supplies to the UK and later the Soviet Union once they were invaded. At first we didn't, because they were working with the Nazis to split up and partition Poland, then did mass deportation, all this stuff. But once they were invaded, we made the determination, and it was the correct determination, that Hitler was an inherently destructive force. There's no negotiating with Hitler. He is a genocidal maniac. He's a freak. We need to stop him, because if he conquers the Soviet Union, then who's left to stand against him? It's like the UK and Australia. Like, it's not a lot of options there, Chief.
Supported, for example, when we said we're not going to get involved in war, but we sent huge amounts of equipment, most of the trucks the Soviet.
Okay, people asking in chat, how does Charlie not know this? I don't want to like lambast him for not knowing it, because I'm like a nerd for this stuff. So yes, I know about this, but you know, I would like to think that, you know, I wouldn't get lambasted if I was in a similar position and there was some like foreign policy issue somebody asked me about, and it's like, Dylan, you're the foreign policy guy, why don't you know this? It's like, well, there's a lot of things to know. So I'm not going to lambast him too hard for it, but it is somewhat common knowledge, at least when it comes to World War II, I think.
Union used were from the United States, and when we sent Tommy guns to the UK before Pearl Harbor, we were providing huge amounts of armaments to nations that were 5, 6, 7,000 miles away to fight a threat to them. Was that wrong prior to Pearl Harbor?
No, but were we sending them to Soviet Russia? Is that what you were saying?
Yes, we were. Yes.
We were sending arms to Soviet Russia. Absolutely.
Okay. No, that's where I got.
I don't think we didn't send arms. We sent trucks, trains, and food, if I remember correctly. I don't think we ever sent arms specifically. Did we? I always remembered it was trucks, trains, and food, right? Truck, trains, and food was what was hammered into me. Was it arms as well? Fighter planes? Oh, that wouldn't be too surprising.
Confused because I said, aren't we now supposed to fight Russia?
The context is
we sent Shermans. Oh, I didn't know that. Did we? Could somebody send me a link on that? I want to see a Sherman with like a Soviet symbol on it. That's an interesting image in my head.
Different because the enemy back then was the Third Reich. I mean,
understandably,
but it amplifies the point. Well, Soviet Russia was not a democracy. It's like
again. It's a weird comparison because Ukraine is a democracy. All international monitors seem to agree that the election for Zelensky between Petro Poroshenko peacefully and democratically handed over power to Zelensky after he won the election, right? It is democratic. So we're already in a much more extreme scenario here than we are when it comes to Ukraine, when we're talking about the morality here. But it is a good example to bring up because even if you were to take out those elements, like there is something to be said about sending the Soviet Union guns to stop this even worse maniac than Stalin.
Like,
No,
you know,
it's
okay,
far from it. It's evil.
Ukraine is corrupt.
Wait, did he just say it was evil to send guns, or did he just call the Soviet Union evil? I think, okay, whatever. Let's listen again.
No, that's
but it amplifies the point. Soviet Russia was not a democracy. It's like,
No,
you know,
it's
okay,
far from it. It's evil.
Ukraine is corrupt. I get it. Well, wasn't the Soviet Union a little bit more corrupt?
I just want to make sure I understand.
A lot more corrupt. Maybe not. Let's not say a little bit more corrupt. A lot more corrupt. Definitely when we talk about Stalin, the Soviet Union. We sent 400,000 jeeps and trucks, 14,000 airplanes. Wow. 8,000 tractors, 13,000. What? Really? We sent 180 billion, a lot more than what we've sent Ukraine so far. Oh my goodness. Wow. Wow, oh my goodness. I didn't know we sent that much. I didn't realize that. Damn.
And so you're saying in some sense that Vladimir Putin is similar to the Nazis and Adolf Hitler?
No, I'm saying that you supply aid.
I don't know how this is going so far over Charlie's head here. I thought the comparison was kind of clear, even if I have a problem somewhat with the comparison when it comes to democracy on the Democratic front.
To those who are being intimidated, bullied, and invaded, irrespective of the quality internally of those nations' governments.
That's part of real politics. I get that.
Yes, absolutely.
Didn't Lend-Lease eventually get us into the war?
Well, I think Pearl Harbor got us into the war.
Oh my God!
So I think, you know, troops on the ground was when Imperial Japan killed Americans on U.S. soil.
Oh my God! I don't know if I can show this on stream. I can't believe it. Sebastian Gorka just brutally murdered Charlie Kirk. Why did Charlie even walk into that? This is like a lot of like what did Charlie miss like the World War II like section of like his history class? Did he like completely ignore history while in college? Like didn't look into it at all? Like does he know why we entered World War II? Like does he know about Pearl Harbor? Like the reason we directly entered World War II was, you know, Pearl Harbor. That had to do with the embargo on Japan, which after Japan struck, then Hitler was like, okay, well, we've been wanting to fight the Americans anyway, so they also declared war, and then boom, we entered the wider war. Charlie never went to college? Oh, well. I mean, I'm not gonna hate on anybody for not going to college, right? But maybe he should. Maybe he should.
But supplying weapons and getting involved, despite multiple provocations, Hitler declaring war on America, didn't it get us closer to getting involved?
Well, I think
also let's also acknowledge the fact that World War II, 2023, very different time periods. Russia, there's no like chance that could you imagine a Russian attack Pearl Harbor style on America today? Could you imagine that? Like Russia's like, damn, we can't even beat Ukraine. Oh, I got a great idea. What is it? Defense Minister Shoigu, what do you think we should do? How about instead of just fighting Ukraine, we fight Ukraine, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, France, Germany, Denmark, Norway, the UK, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and like that's all like everyone, like Japan would probably get involved. Like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? I don't really think the comparison's apt here because Russia's kind of like between a rock and a hard place. They can't attack us because it only makes the situation worse for them. If they can't beat Ukraine, how are they going to beat all of NATO?
I think it was inevitable because when you're facing somebody who wants to have domination of the Eurasian landmass, America probably should be on a side of that isn't supporting him. So
I don't want to get too fear-mongery about Russia. Like I don't think Russia's going to invade America or anything. But it is the foundation of geopolitics is a book that is taught in Russian military academies. I actually think it's mandatory reading for Russian military officers, and that was written by Alexander Dugin, the Eurasianist. The like far right Eurasianist. The same, and in that book it talks about fomenting racial tensions in the United States in an attempt to start a race war. Because they knew they couldn't invade America, so they wanted to destroy America from inside by fomenting extremist political tensions, both sides of the aisle, for like playing them against each other, and trying to foment racial tensions possibly cause racial conflict there, and i.e. spill out race war. So I don't necessarily think Russia's going to be successful in that, or Russia's going to make a really hard attempt at that, even though we know the Internet Research Agency has tried to like pump up both sides and spread disinformation. We haven't seen anything attempted on that in a wide scale, but there is some strains of truth to what Gorka is saying.
Whether we gave one Tommy gun or a million Tommy guns is irrespective. When you have a nation that says, I want to own the Eurasian landmass, if you read Spikeman, Mackinder, the Rimland, the Heartland, you know that there are certain actors whose actions will not be will not touch upon American national interest in a way that is nugatory. So, you know, Hitler or the Soviet Union sooner or later will be America's problem. And the last point that I'd make with regards to the Ukraine, and this is where I find it really galling that anybody who says they're a conservative says, we don't care, pull down the shutters on the Atlantic coast, pull down the shutters on the Pacific, and let the rest of the world rot in hell. What would Ronald Reagan say about the Ukrainians fighting for their freedom? If you look at...
I couldn't care less. I'm sorry. Like, I'm not a conservative. I could not care less what Ronald Reagan would say. Well, have we tried giving the Russians HIV? I could care less. They got that crocodile over there. Can we pump that up? I have no clue what he would say. I don't know. I assume he would vaguely support you. I have no idea, and I don't care what he would say. But I'm not a conservative. He's speaking to a conservative audience.
At his willingness to stand up to communism everywhere, you would say that Reagan wouldn't exactly call a KGB colonel a champion for what, the West or anti-globalism? So let's remember, if we are a shining city on a hill, we need to be a shining city on a hill at all times. And also when it comes to external assistance to Ukraine, this nation where I'm
surprised Charlie's letting them get all of this out too. It could be because Charlie just doesn't have a response, or it could be because he wants him to be a returning guest and he's friends with the guy. I have no clue.
Sitting right now would still be part of the British Commonwealth. It would be a colony of the
Didn't Reagan really support Taiwan, like hardcore on the campaign trail? Reagan like wrote a speech he wanted to make about Taiwan on a post-it note and like handed it to his advisors, and I remember what I read was that his advisors concluded that if he made that speech, there could be a real risk of war. It was like, damn, what's in that secret Reagan Taiwan speech? Oh my God, what did he write down there? He was like, well, it's time to expand West Taiwan, and what I mean is Beijing, and then like we're gonna launch an invasion from here. And like, what was that speech? My goodness. LS Picadio, I don't know how to say your name, but thank you for the Prime, being sub for 8 months. Is Gorka trying to rebrand himself as less of a fuckwit? Well, I mean, not really. I don't think so. And plus, I think the middle part of this section he kind of like nosedived a bit. But he did better than Charlie Kirk here, and you know, that's something. Honestly, Gorka performed relatively well here, against Charlie at least, besides possibly like the middle section.
UK, if France hadn't assisted us, the nascent revolution.
I mean, like, even if I have problems with some of the things Gorka said, especially when it came to reserves and some of the specifics, I don't want to get too much into it. I gotta watch the State of the Union later anyway. But Charlie here, in my mind, got like pretty blown out. I don't know. That's what it felt like to me. Like, not like it was weird him not knowing the Soviet shipment. Like, I don't know. It felt like he was a little out of his depth here. Definitely when he started repeating Russian talking points, and Gorka was just simply just shaking his head.
Forces, if they hadn't been assisted by French naval blockades, 1776 never would have happened. So the idea that helping another nation fight.
This is something I say all the time. I'm happy to hear somebody, even if I disagree with them on basically everything, say it as well.
For its own territorial integrity is by dint of history not justified. America wouldn't have existed without assistance from the outside.
Do you think $100 billion has been too much?
Nope.
Oh, I think it's insane.
And all my compliments taken away. Really, again, man. Again, when you think of the like, you can even make like the kind of hardcore nationalist type of I only care about our interests like argument of like, well, when you look at the pennies to dollars comparison of the amount of damage we've done to the Russian military, this is the most effective American military investment in the last 40 to 50 to 60 years. Like, you can make that argument. I don't want to. Whatever. My goodness.
I think it's utterly, utterly insane. The fact that we have spent more on Ukraine than we have in Afghanistan since 9/11 is unconscionable. And the idea, the broader point.
By the way, that's not true. That's not true. That's not true. I think he means specifically like money to rebuild, or like military aid to the Afghan military, but that doesn't include the amount of cost it was to launch the invasion, the amount of cost incurred through 20 years of occupation. Like it doesn't incur all those other costs. So that's kind of deceptive. If the entire war in Afghanistan only cost $100 billion, you would have like the best financier in the world. That would be the most pennies to dollar economic war for 20 years, like ever. Like we ended up spending, I think, about like $2 trillion or like $1.5 trillion in Afghanistan. It's not even close.
And this is one that you have hammered out on your podcast frequently. There was no debate, Charlie. How is it
corrupt
that
the Lend-Lease Act, by the way, actually was voted on by Congress. We did sign the Lend-Lease Act when sending over supplies to Ukraine. That was voted on. So the idea, people say there was no debate. There was, and it won overwhelming support from Congress and Senate. It's just that the debate didn't go the way Charlie wanted, so it's like, they don't really pay much attention to that. There was a lot of aid that didn't have debate that was like signed by the president, but what's the complaint there? That every time Biden signed an aid deal, like he should be like, well, I'm gonna go to Congress, I'm gonna have to like do a big speech or something, let's see if we'll make it wait a month, they need the weapons now. And every time we agree to send weapons, like the Abrams, for example, the Abrams that they were going so much over in this conversation, that's going to be sent over to Ukraine at the end of 2023 at best. Okay, like if an amazing magic spell happens, maybe like 6 months, but like most likely we're looking at early 2024, late 2023, and we really want to make these shipments take even more time in a lot of these cases by slowing down the process. Like, the war's happening now, not tomorrow. Ketchup Bacon, thank you so much for the tier 1. I appreciate it.
Steve, I don't know if Steve coined the term, but we have a uniparty.
Also, if he thinks 100 billion is too much, we spent over 180 billion on sending weapons and aid to the Soviets alone. That's not even including the UK when we talk about the Lend-Lease Act to the Soviets. So again, if that was too much, was the Lend-Lease Act, which he was just praising, not too much, or does he just not know how much money we spent in sending aid to the Soviet Union? And we're talking 180 billion in today's money. Dayjuice, thank you so much for the prime.
Apart from those 20 people around the speaker's debate, we have this massive, amorphous uniparty debate. How much aid are we going to give? Is nuclear war okay? Is tactical nukes okay? The idea that has nary been any debate in America is inexcusable.
There has not been no debate. There's been a lot of debate on the House floor about this in relation to the Lend-Lease Act and others. It's just most people agree. So it doesn't have much hiccups, okay? Most people are not Marjorie Taylor Greene. Sorry, or Matt Gaetz.
So I think you can understand my position, though, Dr. Gorka, not just the incompetency of the military elite or brass, but I'd also have this bubbling up frustration of the pace, the focus that Congress puts on this particular border crisis and not our own, which does animate.
Oh my God. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm sick of people making the comparison. Unarmed migrants crossing your border due to gang violence, corruption, or low living standards is not the same as tanks coming to your village, burning down your local hospital, and filling up mass graves full of bodies, the largest mass grave uncovered in Europe since the Yugoslav genocide. I'm sorry, but this is not comparing this as an insult.
Honestly, some of my
everybody who compares this is sheltered. I'm just going to say that. Everybody who compares this is sheltered. Charlie's never been anywhere close to even to a war zone, I would assume, just from hearing that statement. Because I don't think anybody who's even been close to a war zone could ever even try to compare those two things.
Projection to just want to get further involved, which could end up being a quagmire, because it seems like the foreign policy establishment wants to get involved in, let's just say, theaters of conflict that don't always have inevitable endings for profits or for whatever other reason. But I suppose I do want you to, without you know, without mentioning the Lend Lease thing, I understand, but why is it an urgent national security threat to us? And the bully argument, I got that, but why is Putin taking over Ukraine a threat?
Does he just want us to say like resources are cool? Like is that what he wants? He just wants like a selfish kind of like, look, there's a lot of resources in Ukraine, there's consumers in Ukraine. This is probably not where Putin's going to stop. Ukraine is not Putin's last goal and is not the last goal of his administration. Like what more numbers do we need to hit on for him? Like what argument would convince him?
To Rhode Island.
Because it won't stop with Ukraine. And it will escalate to NATO nations. NATO nations that, by the way, we helped create that club. It is a club of free countries. And the idea that Poland doesn't have a right to exist because a former KGB colonel says so, that's not something we can ignore. Either we created NATO in 1949 as a club of Western civilization, of nations that agreed together to stand together, or it was a con, it was a fraud, and we didn't mean it, and the Soviet Union wasn't a threat. I don't subscribe to the latter. But your prior point is very well taken, and I completely subscribe to the...
Also, can I say, when it comes to Lend-Lease, I think a lot of people just see Lend-Lease as just like more aid, but I'm pretty sure, and I'm actually positive, Lend-Lease, like, that's stuff that will be paid for. Like, that's the whole idea of Lend-Lease, right? Which was voted on by Congress.
To the frustration that we can send, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars and it doesn't matter. And we look at the fact that we are the only nation in the world today that has no border regime. On my last Newsmax show, I did a very simple back of...
What is he talking? No, the only country in the world, dude, he does. Okay. I'm not... Really? The only country in the world, only country in the world. You know how many, I don't want to get into it, but there's a lot of countries I could bring up right now. That have like a million different border crossings, illegal or otherwise. Like, for example, the amount of refugees that have entered Turkey, right? Does that mean they don't have a border? Like, the Turkey is no longer a real nation state? Like, whatever.
Calculation. And I went to the official statistics. Since World War II, if you add every combat fatality of the U.S. Armed Forces, so Korea, Vietnam, the GWAT, so every, you know, Afghanistan and Iraq, combined, every war we have fought in since 1945 has led to the deaths of 103,000 combat service men and women. 103,000 in 70 years. In the last 12 months, 110,000 have died of fentanyl poisoning in America. So, yeah, I understand the frustration, but that doesn't mean Russia invading other countries on the periphery of our NATO that we helped create can be ignored.
Dude, I'm sorry. I understand your country's been invaded, but have you ever heard of fentanyl?
No, that's all I'm asking for.
Sure, no, and I make no question of the moral sense. It's wrong for a strong country to invade.
By the way, if you were to sit both of these guys and ask about what do you want to do about drug rehabilitation, how do you want to change the drug war, which has obviously not succeeded, and I don't think any of them would be, well, let's talk about decriminalizing, psychedelics and drug use, so we're not imprisoning, people who are using drugs. Let's talk about like needle exchange programs where we can give people resources and stuff like that. And let's talk about housing, because as people are unhoused, they're more likely to consume drugs, and making sure that every American is no, that's not the discussion that's going to be had.
A smaller country and a weaker one. However,
like all the people were like, we should have used all that money to house the homeless. It's like, okay, so do you think we should spend $100 billion to house the homeless? No, what are you, a socialist? It's like, okay, great, fantastic.
Saying that it's an urgent national security threat. And I guess the final point, though, Dr. Gorka, is if he wouldn't stop there, he's struggling to even take over Ukraine. So what's to say that he would go to Warsaw?
Moldova is the best argument. Moldova is the best argument.
Well, this is where... And
also, it's not like Russia hasn't licked their wounds before, re-prepared, and tried again. I mean, this is an example of them doing that. That's why all these countries like Poland ran to NATO after the Soviet Union collapses, because they knew one day Russia would get back up, lick its wounds, and possibly try to reestablish itself as a kingdom, an empire. The empire of Russia, and which is what they're trying to do right now.
I'm glad you said that, because you had a guest on your show just a few days ago who said that Ukraine has lost already, or Ukraine is on the brink of collapse. Yeah, let's be true. Let's be factual about this. Russia was ranked second in military power in the world before this war started. Ukraine was ranked 22nd. Thanks in part to our assistance and the Brits and the Germans, they have pretty much managed to fight Russia to a standstill. That doesn't mean he won't try. The fact that it's been difficult doesn't mean he says, oops, sorry, I finally recognize the Baltic states and I recognize Poland. If he can, he will, because that's the nature of a KGB colonel.
But like, if you look at his like ideology, like of Ivan Ilyich, like this is a compulsion for him. It doesn't stop with Ukraine. Like I don't necessarily think he's going to go and try to conquer Poland right now, or if you even think it's going to happen in his administration or in his lifetime. But his long-term goal is to try to reestablish dominance in countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And part of the negotiations that happened before the invasion of Ukraine was trying to negotiate less protections, less NATO protections on those states. So, I mean, it's very clearly like part of his mind. That's why the same justification could be used to invade those countries that he used to invade Ukraine. Maybe not all of them, but actually now as the war's going on, when it comes to the Nazi justifications, a lot of governments have been called Nazi governments by Russian state media. So that might be changing a little bit, but a lot of the justification was designed that way. They weren't, like, Putin wasn't stupid when he wrote that speech. He spent, it's very obvious he wrote it himself, because like when he gets into history, Putin's an extremely boring speaker, and the speech largely was a very boring speech. And I think that like he designed it to be like that. It wasn't like an accident, like, oops, accidental justification to invade Estonia.
But at the end of the day, you're right. So, God bless the Ukrainians. They've done pretty well.
Do you think Ukraine should be part of NATO?
No, I don't think they're ready for that. No.
Look, my position on Ukraine and NATO is, if Ukraine can get in NATO, I have no problem with it. Well, no problem with it whatsoever. But if that's an impossible goal, then we should negotiate some defensive pact either between the United States, the UK, and Ukraine and a few other NATO states, any NATO state that would be willing to do it outside of NATO. There has to be some defensive agreement that Ukraine's a part of, or there's a decent chance that the Russians will just try again if there's no large disincentive like there is for Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which would be easier countries for the Russians to invade, but they haven't because of NATO membership. Zelensky talked about not only ending this war, but winning this war to end the cycle of violence between Russia and Ukraine. And I do agree with that.
So NATO, the NATO accession principles are very clear. Any nation that has representative government in the Eurasian region can join NATO if it has a functioning representative government, and if the nation can contribute to the collective defense of the whole. Ukraine doesn't satisfy either of those.
I have no clue where he pulls that from.
It doesn't have a well-functioning representative democracy.
I mean, you could say that it doesn't function to your standard, but it is a representative democracy. What more do you need to see to make those changes to allow them to join NATO? And what of those standards does Turkey meet that Ukraine doesn't? Because if you want to talk about a well-functioning representative democracy, Turkey's in NATO, okay? So look, I do think there needs to be improvements made when it comes to Ukrainian governance, but really? You're saying it's worse than Turkey? Really? Come on, get out of here.
And it doesn't have the capacity to substantively contribute.
Also, and the idea that it can't contribute to the defense of NATO, considering what they've just done this is the more insulting part to me, what they've just done in the war against Russian aggression, absolutely ridiculous. We're going to finish this up. State of the Union speech is starting.
Contribute to the collective defense of the North Atlantic Treaty Area. If it did, that would be another question, but it doesn't.
Dr. Sebastian Gorka, about 20 seconds. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'm so glad we did this. I mean,
look, I'm going to be honest. Gorka did really good against Charlie, but he still had a lot of failings here. Charlie was just spouting literal Russian talking points at some point, so I don't think it was that difficult for Sebastian. I think it's part of the reason why he performed so well in comparison relative to Charlie, but he still had some failing here, whether it had to deal with cash aid, military aid, and Western aid, or this conclusion at the end. He had some failings that I still have a lot of problems with. But still, he did steamroll Charlie, but outside of that, still had a lot of problems with what he had to say too.
Want us to have more sophisticated national security debates on the right. It's not isolationism
Very sophisticated. Wait, we sent aid to the Soviet Union?
versus invade everywhere. There is a happy medium. Educate yourselves, read a bit of Clausewitz, read a bit of Sun Tzu, and let's have a discussion on all
read a bit of Sun Tzu. Look, Art of War is a good book, but I don't know if it would be my first recommendation.
platforms.
Dr. Gorka, God bless you. Thank you so much.
God bless.
Okay, that's enough of that. Wow, Gorka semi-W. Big surprise.